The lantern at the platform's edge swayed gently in the cool prairie breeze, casting amber shadows that flickered like the last embers of a hearth slowly dimming for the night. You found yourself standing at the polished brass step of a Pullman carriage, the year etched faintly into your memory as 1880, though such precise dates feel softer here, drifting like steam from a kettle into the open evening air. The conductor, a kind older gentleman with silver whiskers and a navy wool coat that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and rain, offered his gloved hand with a quiet smile, inviting you upward into the warm golden glow of the corridor beyond. There was no rush, no hurry, no clamour of the modern world to disturb the gentle hush settling over this sleepy moment in time. You stepped softly inside, and the door closed behind you with a soft, reassuring click, sealing away every worry, every concern, every restless thought you had carried with you to this quiet place. The air within was warm and welcoming, scented with cedarwood panelling, oiled leather upholstery, and the faintest trace of beeswax polish. Somewhere far ahead, a bell rang twice, slow and melodic, and the great iron wheels began to turn beneath you, easing the carriage forward with a rhythm so smooth, so steady, it felt almost like breathing. Settle in, traveller. Lower your shoulders, let your eyelids grow heavy. We are about to journey through a century long since faded into legend. As the carriage finds its gentle rhythm upon the rails, swaying ever so softly from side to side like a cradle rocked by unseen hands, allow yourself to sink deeper into the velvet cushions awaiting your weary frame. Before we drift further into the long American night, before the prairie melts into shadow and the stars begin their silent procession across the heavens, there is a small whispered tradition I would share with you. In this old-world manner of travel where strangers became companions through the slow passage of miles, it was customary to leave a quiet token of gratitude for the storyteller who guided your journey. A nod, a smile, a kind word in the ledger book kept beside the conductor's lantern. Today that token takes a softer, simpler form. If the gentle cadence of this voice brings comfort to your restless mind, if these slow tales of forgotten centuries help carry you toward the quiet shores of sleep, you are warmly invited to tap the small bell beneath this story, the one we now call subscribe, and ring it once with a quiet finger. Should you wish, you may also leave a notification chime upon the velvet ribbon so that future journeys find you wherever you may rest. There is no urgency, no obligation, only an open hand extended in the warm lantern light. And now, with that gentle matter settled, let us return our attention to the passing landscape, to the slow, faithful rhythm of the wheels. The carriage in which you now reside was a marvel of its age, a wooden palace upon iron wheels, conceived in the workshops of George Mortimer Pullman, and crafted by hands so patient, so meticulous, that every joint, every dovetail, every brass fitting bore the quiet signature of pride. Look about you now, slowly, without strain, allowing your gaze to drift along the curving ceiling overhead. The roof of this Pullman Palace car arched gently upward in what railwaymen of that era called a clerestory, a raised central spine punctuated by small stained-glass windows that filtered the lamplight into colours of cranberry amber and pale moss green. By day, sunlight would tumble through those panes in shafts of jewelled brilliance, scattering across the polished floors in slow, drifting patterns. By night, as it is now, the small kerosene lamps fixed to the walls cast a warm, honeyed glow that softened every edge, blurred every harsh line, and turned the long corridor of the carriage into something that felt almost dreamlike, almost remembered rather than seen. The walls themselves were panelled in dark Honduran mahogany, hand-rubbed with linseed oil until the wood gleamed with a depth that seemed to draw the eye inward, as though one might peer past the surface and into the slow rings of the tree from which it had been cut some 40 or 50 years before. Inlays of lighter satin wood traced delicate floral patterns along the upper panels, slender vines and stylized rosettes that no machine could yet reproduce, the work of a marquetry artisan in Detroit or Philadelphia who had bent over his workbench for weeks to render these quiet ornaments. Run your fingertips lightly along the wainscoting beside your seat. Feel the gentle ripple of the grain beneath the lacquer, the cool smoothness broken only by the faint rise of a dovetail joint, the small honest seam where one craftsman's labour met another's. There is something deeply restful in such workmanship, something that whispers of unhurried days and hands that knew their tools the way a violinist knows the bow. The floor beneath your feet was covered in a heavy Brussels carpet of deep burgundy wool, woven with patterns of acanthus leaves and ivy that wound their way down the length of the aisle. The pile was thick, plush, and worn just slightly along the central path where countless travellers had passed before you, their footsteps softened by the dense weave so that no echo, no clatter, no harsh report ever rose from the floor. Beneath the carpet lay an underlayment of cork and horsehair, packed tight to muffle the rumble of the rails below, and beneath that the iron-strapped oak of the carriage frame itself, fastened with bolts as thick as a man's thumb. It was this layered insulation that gave the Pullman its famed quietude, its reputation for offering a hush so complete that passengers often said one could hear the ticking of a pocket watch from across the lounge. The seats around you were upholstered in a deep emerald velvet, tufted in the Chesterfield manner with small buttons of polished brass set deep into the cushions. Each tuft created a soft diamond pattern across the back and seat, and within those diamonds the velvet had grown ever so slightly burnished from the gentle pressure of countless travellers who had rested there before. Lean back now and feel the way the cushion accepts your weight, yielding just enough, supporting just enough, the horsehair stuffing beneath the velvet shifting, in that slow, accommodating manner that no modern foam can quite imitate. Along the headrest, a small antimacassar of crocheted ivory lace lay folded and pinned, its purpose to protect the velvet from the macassar oil that gentlemen of the era often used to dress their hair. The lace itself was the work of some unknown woman, perhaps a Pullman seamstress in Chicago, perhaps a contracted lacemaker in a quiet New England town, her fingers moving in tiny, precise loops by the light of an oil lamp on a winter's evening, some years before this very carriage rolled westward. The windows beside you were tall and rectangular, framed in the same warm mahogany that lined the walls, and each was fitted with 2 layers of glass, an inner pane and an outer storm pane, separated by a narrow channel of still air that helped to keep the heat within and the prairie chill without. The lower sash could be raised by means of a small brass pull, but on this evening the windows remained closed, and beyond the glass the world rolled past in slow, dreamlike succession. Heavy curtains of crimson damask hung on either side, gathered back with twisted silk cords ending in small tassels that swayed in time with the carriage's gentle rocking. The damask was patterned with a faint medallion design, woven not printed, so that the figures shifted subtly when the lamplight caught them at different angles, blooming and fading like shapes seen through a deep pool of water. Above each window a small fringed valance softened the upper edge, and tucked discreetly behind the valance ran the brass speaking tube that connected each compartment to the porter's station at the far end of the car. A traveller in need of fresh tea, an extra blanket, or a moment of quiet conversation had only to lift the small ivory whistle attached to the tube, blow once gently, and a porter in his crisp white jacket would appear within minutes, moving down the aisle with the practised silence of a man who had walked these same floorboards for 1,000 miles or more. The ceiling above the central aisle was painted in a pale ivory enamel, but along its edges, where the curve met the upper panels, a slender band of stenciled ornament traced its way from one end of the carriage to the other. The pattern was inspired by the aesthetic movement then sweeping through the parlours of fashionable America, with its faint Japanese influences, its stylized chrysanthemums and cranes, its quiet asymmetry. The colours were muted, dusty rose and sage green and the soft gold of late autumn wheat, and they seemed almost to breathe in the lamplight, expanding and contracting with the slow rhythm of the wheels below. Set at intervals along the upper walls, small silvered mirrors caught and multiplied the lamplight, scattering it in soft, indirect ways throughout the carriage, so that no single point ever felt too bright, no corner ever fell into harsh shadow. The mirrors themselves were beveled at their edges, and where the bevels caught the light they cast tiny rainbows upon the opposite walls, shimmering softly whenever the carriage swayed. This was no mere conveyance, no simple wooden box for the transport of bodies from one distant city to another. This was a moving room, a parlour on wheels, a quiet drawing room that travelled at 30 miles an hour through a continent still in the slow process of being mapped, named and known. And you, dear traveller, are seated within it now, sinking ever deeper into the velvet cushions, feeling the warmth of the lamplight upon your face, listening to the soft creak of seasoned wood and the faraway rhythm of the wheels, and understanding, perhaps for the first time in a long while, what it means to travel without hurry, to journey without anxiety, to simply be carried gently and faithfully through the long quiet night. Allow your gaze now to drift upward, slowly, gently toward the small kerosene lamp affixed to the wall just above your shoulder. It is a fine example of what the railwaymen of 1880 called a pinch lamp, though the model in this particular carriage was likely a brass railway sconce of the sort manufactured in the great lamp foundries of Meriden, Connecticut, where for half a century skilled brass smiths had cast and shaped the lighting fixtures that illuminated nearly every passenger train in North America. The lamp itself is mounted upon a small swivelling arm, allowing it to be turned slightly toward a reader's book or away from a sleeper's eyes, and at this hour it has been adjusted just so, casting its glow at an angle that warms the velvet beside you without ever touching your face directly. The reservoir at the base of the lamp is a small bulb of cut crystal, faceted in a diamond pattern that catches the flame within and refracts it outward in 1,000 tiny sparks. Inside the reservoir, perhaps 1/4 of a pint of refined kerosene rests in still amber repose, its surface unbroken save for the slender brass wick tube that rises through its centre. The kerosene itself was a relatively new luxury in the year 1880, having only displaced whale oil and tallow candles within the previous 2 decades, and it burned with a clean, steady golden flame that the older travellers among the passengers still found quietly miraculous. Above the reservoir, the wick rises through a small turning key of knurled brass, and above that the flame burns within a tall chimney of hand-blown glass, its surface faintly rippled with the gentle imperfections that mark all glass made by human breath rather than by machine. The chimney is fluted at its top, narrowing slightly to draw the heat upward and to encourage the flame to burn taller and steadier, and through this fluted aperture rises a thin ribbon of warmth that you can feel, just barely, if you hold your palm a few inches above the lamp. The flame itself is a small living thing, no larger than a sparrow's heart, and yet within its modest compass dwell the full spectrum of warm hues that have soothed human eyes since the first cave fires were lit. At its base, where the flame meets the wick, a small core of deep blue burns almost invisibly, the hottest portion of the fire, surrounded by a halo of pale gold that broadens upward into a soft amber and finally tapers at its tip into the gentlest of orange whispers. Watch the flame for a moment. Notice how it does not flicker wildly as a candle in a draught might do, but rather sways with the slow, patient rhythm of the carriage itself, dipping ever so slightly when the wheels pass over a joint in the rails, recovering its poise within the breath of a moment. Around the lamp itself, a polished brass sconce reflects the flame outward in soft, indirect ways. The sconce is shaped like a half-moon, its inner surface engraved with a faint scrollwork pattern that catches the light and scatters it in delicate filigreed shadows upon the mahogany panel behind. The brass has been polished by some patient porter in the early hours of the morning before the first passengers boarded, and where his cloth lingered longest the metal gleams with a depth that seems almost liquid, as though one might dip a fingertip into it and find it warm. Throughout the carriage perhaps 12 such lamps burn in their quiet stations, spaced at intervals of some 6 or 7 feet along the walls, each one casting its small pool of light that overlaps gently with its neighbours, so that no portion of the carriage falls into true darkness, yet no portion is harshly illuminated either. The overall effect is one of warm, layered radiance, the kind of light that painters of the period called Rembrandtesque, for it modelled the faces of the travellers in soft chiaroscuro, deepening their thoughts, softening their features, lending even the most ordinary countenance a quiet dignity it might never have known by daylight. At the front and rear of the carriage, larger lanterns hung from the clerestory ceiling, suspended by chains of polished brass that swung in slow pendulum-like arcs as the train moved forward. These ceiling lanterns were fitted with multiple wicks, 3 or 4 arranged in a circle, and their combined glow spread outward in great soft circles that washed the upper panels and the painted ceiling in honeyed light. The chains that held them were each composed of small interlocking links, hand-forged in some Pittsburgh foundry, and they rang faintly against one another whenever the carriage rocked, producing a sound so soft, so distant that it seemed less a sound than a memory of one. Outside the windows the world had grown dark, and the few lanterns visible in the passing landscape, hanging from distant farmhouses or held aloft by some lonely figure walking a country road, appeared as small floating points of light, drifting past the glass-like fireflies suspended in deep water. Within the carriage, the contrast made the lamps seem all the warmer, all the more comforting, for they were not merely sources of illumination but small faithful companions. Each one tended by human hands earlier in the evening, each one trimmed and filled and lit with a small wooden match struck against the brass plate at its base. The smell of burning kerosene, faint but unmistakable, hung gently in the air, mingling with the cedarwood panelling and the beeswax polish and the lingering trace of someone's bergamot tea from the lounge car ahead. It was not an unpleasant scent, this kerosene, but rather a warm, slightly sweet, almost oily aroma that the travellers of the era associated with safety, with home, with the long evening hours when families gathered in their parlours to read aloud or to listen to a daughter at the piano. To breathe it now is to breathe the very air of the 19th century, an air saturated with the small patient labours of countless unseen hands. Above the lamp nearest you, the mahogany panel has darkened just slightly over the years from the rising heat of the flame, taking on a deeper, richer hue in a small oval halo that traces the lamp's faithful presence. Such markings were considered honourable in their day, signs that a carriage had been well used, well travelled, and well loved, and the porters never sought to scrub them away. They were in their quiet way the rings of a tree, the fingerprints of time itself, and they spoke of all the souls who had passed through this particular space and read by this particular lamp on countless other nights in countless other landscapes long before you arrived. Lean back now and let the lamplight settle upon your eyelids like a warm blanket, soft and golden and infinitely patient. There is nothing here to fear, nothing here to hurry. The lamp will burn faithfully through the long night, and the carriage will carry you onward, and all is well, all is well, all is well. If you would, dear traveller, allow your gaze to wander now toward the upper portion of the carriage, where the long polished panels of mahogany meet the curved ceiling above. There, running the full length of the car along both walls, you will notice a series of smooth wooden enclosures, each one fitted flush against the upper panelling, and held in place by an elegant arrangement of brass hinges and silken cords. These are the sleeping berths, the famed innovation that elevated George Pullman from a humble Chicago cabinet maker to one of the most celebrated industrialists of his age, and they are perhaps the single feature of this carriage that most distinguishes it from the rough, unforgiving travel of earlier decades. By day, when the sun rolled high over the prairie and the passengers sat upright in their velvet chairs reading newspapers or sipping tea, these upper berths remained closed and tucked away, indistinguishable from the rest of the wooden ceiling save for the faint seam where their edges met the panels. To the casual eye they were simply ornamental moulding, an extension of the carriage's quiet woodwork, and the architecture of the daytime parlour remained unbroken. But as evening descended and the porters began their slow ceremonial rounds, those same berths would be lowered upon their hinges with a gentle, well-oiled creak, revealing the soft world of sleep that had waited patiently above all day long. The lower berths, meanwhile, were formed by the clever transformation of the velvet seats themselves. Each pair of facing chairs could be drawn together, their cushions lifted, the backs folded down, and within the span of perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, what had been a comfortable parlour seating area became a long, level mattress upon which a weary traveller might stretch full length and rest. The porter who performed this transformation moved with the practised grace of a man who had done it 10,000 times, his hands working without hesitation, his movements so smooth that the entire process seemed almost a kind of slow, silent ballet, performed in the soft lamplight of the evening corridor. Imagine now that the porter has drawn near to your particular berth. He is a tall, dignified man of perhaps 40 years, his dark complexion warmed by the lamplight, his white jacket pressed crisp and clean, his black trousers cuffed neatly above his polished shoes. Upon his sleeve a small embroidered insignia indicates his rank within the Pullman service, and at his belt hangs a chain of small brass keys that ring softly as he moves. He greets you with a quiet nod, a soft "good evening, sir," or "good evening, madam," his voice low so as not to disturb the other passengers, and he begins his work with hands that have grown skilled through long apprenticeship in this peculiar art. First, he removes the small velvet cushions from the seat backs, folding them neatly and stowing them in a small compartment built into the wall beneath the window. Next, he releases two brass catches at the upper corners of the seat back, and the back itself folds down upon a hidden hinge, becoming part of the bed's level surface. From the same hidden compartment he draws forth a fine cotton sheet of bleached white linen, crisp and slightly cool to the touch, smelling faintly of the lavender water in which it had been laundered some days before in the great Pullman commissary kitchens of Chicago. He spreads the sheet with two practiced flicks of his wrists, smoothing it across the cushions, tucking its edges beneath the mattress, with the precise corner folds that the British called hospital corners and that the American railway men had adopted as their own standard. Above this lower bed he then reaches up to the closed upper berth and releases the silken cord that holds it flush against the ceiling. The berth descends slowly upon its hinges, supported by a counterweight system concealed within the upper panelling, until it comes to rest in a horizontal position perhaps 4 feet above the lower bed. Within this upper berth lies a second mattress already made up with its own crisp linen, its own soft pillow, its own folded woolen blanket. A small ladder, light and cleverly hinged, is unfolded from a recess beside the window, and its base is set firmly upon the carpeted floor while its upper rungs hook into small brass receivers along the edge of the upper berth. The mattress within each berth was a thing of considerable comfort by the standards of its day. It was filled with a layered combination of horsehair, cotton wadding, and a topmost layer of soft lamb's wool, all encased within a heavy ticking of blue and white striped cotton. Each mattress was perhaps 6 feet in length and just over 2 feet in width, generous enough for a single sleeper to stretch fully without the discomfort of a curled spine. The pillows were filled with goose down, plump and yielding, sheathed in a slip of fine percale embroidered along its open edge with the small Pullman crest, a discreet stylized P entwined with railway laurels. Over each berth hung a curtain of heavy green serge, suspended from a brass rod that ran the full length of the upper berth's outer edge. These curtains, when drawn closed, created a private sleeping chamber separated from the corridor and from the neighbouring berths by a thick fabric wall, dim and quiet and womb-like in its enclosure. The serge was densely woven, almost lightless when fully drawn, and along its inner edge a row of small brass rings allowed the sleeper to fasten the curtains shut from within, securing both privacy and a peaceful darkness. Within each berth, set into the wall beside the pillow, you would find a small brass-framed alcove containing the night necessities of the late 19th century traveller, a small reading lamp, dimmer than the wall sconces of the corridor, fitted with a tinted glass shade of pale rose colour, so as to produce a light suitable for reading without piercing the surrounding gloom, a net pouch in which to stow one's pocket watch, eyeglasses, or a small book, tiny brass hook upon which a man might hang his suspenders or a woman her chatelaine, and in the most luxurious of the Pullman cars, a small porcelain pitcher of water and a single drinking glass, replenished each evening by the porter as he made his rounds. The act of climbing into one's berth was, for the sleepers of 1880, a small private ritual, a gentle threshold between the waking world of the parlour and the dream world of the night. One ascended the ladder slowly, holding a candle or a small folded nightshirt, drew the heavy serge curtain shut behind oneself, and then settled into the soft mattress with the carriage swaying gently below. The walls of the berth seemed to absorb sound, muffling even the quiet conversations of distant passengers into a soft murmur, and the ceiling hung close enough that one could reach up and touch it, lending the small space a pleasant feeling of enclosure, of safety, off the kind of cozy harbourage that a child might once have built between the cushions of a parlour sofa. To sleep within a Pullman berth was to be carried gently across the continent in a small wooden womb of one's own, rocked by the rails, warmed by the stove at the carriage's end, lulled by the distant whistle of the locomotive, and held safely within the patient artistry of 1,000 unseen hands. While we have lingered for some time within the soft warmth of this carriage, allow your imagination now to drift forward, beyond the passenger cars, beyond the baggage car, beyond the tender heaped with its great mound of bituminous coal, and out to the very head of the train, where the locomotive itself labours faithfully through the prairie night. It is a magnificent machine, this locomotive, a thing of iron and brass and steam and fire, and although you will not see it from your seat in the parlour car, you may feel its presence in every gentle vibration that passes through the floor beneath you, in every distant whistle that drifts back through the chill night air. The locomotive at the head of this particular train is most likely a 4240, the classic American type that had become, by the year 1880, the very symbol of railroading across the continent. The number designates its wheel arrangement: 4 small leading wheels mounted upon a swivelling truck at the front, 4 large driving wheels in the middle, and no trailing wheels at all. This configuration had been refined over 40 years of American innovation, and it had proved itself perfectly suited to the long curves and uncertain track conditions of the still-growing transcontinental network. The leading truck guided the engine smoothly into curves, the driving wheels delivered ample power, and the absence of trailing wheels kept the locomotive light and nimble despite its considerable mass. The boiler of such a locomotive was a long horizontal cylinder of riveted iron plate, perhaps 5 feet in diameter and 12 feet in length, lagged with a thick layer of mineral wool and sheathed in polished Russia iron, a special material whose surface had been treated to give it a deep, lustrous, almost iridescent blue-black sheen. Along the top of the boiler rose a series of smaller cylinders, each with its own distinct purpose. The steam dome, set forward of centre, contained the throttle valve through which steam was admitted to the cylinders. The sand dome, set further forward, held a small reservoir of dry sand that could be released onto the rails for traction when the wheels began to slip on grades or in wet weather. And at the very front of the boiler stood the great brass bell, polished daily until it shone like a small captured sun, and the locomotive's whistle, a tall slender pipe of polished brass that produced the long, mournful, melodic cry that travellers across the American continent had come to know as the very voice of the railroad itself. At the front of the locomotive, mounted upon the leading truck, the great cowcatcher swept downward in 2 angled wedges of iron rails, designed to gently brush aside any small obstruction that might lie upon the tracks. Upon the prairie of 1880, such obstructions might include a stray bison calf separated from its herd, a fallen branch from a cottonwood tree, or in the most unfortunate cases, a wandering domestic animal from a distant farmstead. The cowcatcher allowed the locomotive to clear such impediments without harm to itself or to its passengers, and its angled iron bars had grown burnished and silvery from the steady abrasion of the grass and gravel they brushed aside upon every journey. Above the cowcatcher, mounted upon the very front of the boiler, hung the great headlamp, an enormous lantern of brass and glass perhaps 2 feet in diameter. Within the headlamp burned an oil-fed flame, magnified and projected forward by a parabolic silver reflector that had been polished to such a perfect mirror finish that it could cast a beam of golden light a quarter-mile down the track on a clear night. The headlamp was the locomotive's eye upon the long dark roads of the continent, and the sight of its approaching glow upon the horizon had, in the imagination of the era, become a symbol of progress itself, of civilization moving westward through the great empty spaces of the American interior. Behind the headlamp, mounted upon the boiler's smokestack, a small plume of thick black coal smoke rose continuously into the night sky, lit from below by the orange glow of the firebox, and curling upward in slow turbulent rolls before dispersing into the high prairie wind. The smokestack itself was crowned with a flared bonnet of perforated iron designed to capture the larger sparks that might otherwise escape and ignite the dry grass of the surrounding plains. beneath the bonnet, smaller cinders and embers glowed briefly orange before settling, dying, and falling harmlessly to the gravel ballast alongside the rails. Within the cab of the locomotive, two men laboured faithfully through the long night. The engineer stood at his post on the right-hand side, his hand resting lightly upon the long brass throttle lever, his eyes fixed upon the rails illuminated by the headlamp's beam. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, with calloused hands and a weathered face, dressed in dark wool overalls and a striped cotton cap. His pocket watch chained to his vest and synchronized that very morning with the official railroad time at the Omaha station. To his left, the fireman tended the great firebox, his shovel rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he fed measured amounts of coal into the roaring orange furnace beneath the boiler. The fireman was younger, perhaps 25, his face streaked with the soot that no amount of washing could fully remove, and his shoulders were broad with the strength that his labour demanded. The cab itself was a small wooden enclosure built atop the rear of the locomotive, open to the elements at the sides, save for small leather curtains that could be drawn against the wind and rain. Within the cab, the air was hot and dry, heated by the radiating warmth of the boiler and the open mouth of the firebox, and the two men worked in shirt-sleeves even on the coldest nights, their faces flushed and their brows beaded with perspiration. Around them, a constellation of brass gauges and valves indicated the pressures and temperatures of the various boiler systems, and these the engineer monitored continuously, adjusting the throttle and the reverser lever in small, practiced increments to maintain the smooth and steady progress of the train. Behind the locomotive ran the tender, a great open-topped car heaped with several tons of coal and fitted along its sides with iron tanks holding perhaps 3,000 gallons of fresh water. From these tanks the water flowed into the boiler through a series of brass injectors, replacing the water that was continuously vaporized into steam and exhausted through the cylinders and up the smokestack. At intervals along the route, perhaps every 100 miles or so, the train would pause beside one of the great wooden water towers that stood at division points across the network, and the fireman would swing the tower's leather hose into the tender's mouth, refilling the tanks within the span of perhaps 5 or 6 minutes before the journey resumed. All of this, dear traveller, all of this complex and faithful labour takes place far ahead of you in the cold prairie night, while you rest in warmth and comfort within your velvet parlour, and the only evidence of it that reaches you here is the gentle vibration of the floor, the distant melodic cry of the whistle, and the soft, steady, unwavering forward motion that carries you onward through the long American darkness. Turn your gaze now gently toward the tall window at your side, and allow your eyes to follow the slow procession of the world beyond the glass. The prairie of 1880 stretched outward from the rails in every direction, an ocean of grass that rolled toward horizons so distant they seemed almost imaginary, and beneath the silver light of the rising moon that vast landscape now lies revealed in soft monochrome, study in shades of pale blue, deep indigo, and the silvery green of moonlit prairie grass. There are no fences here yet, or so few that the eye can scarcely register them, for the great age of barbed wire has only recently begun, and the open range still extends in every direction without interruption. The grass itself, were you to stand among it in the daylight, would rise to the height of a man's waist or higher, a thick bluestem and switchgrass and Indian grass interwoven with countless smaller plants. Among these grasses dwelt prairie chickens and meadowlarks and the small burrowing creatures that constitute the slow, patient ecology of the American interior. By moonlight, however, the prairie revealed itself only in broad sweeping forms, the individual grasses blurring into a single rolling expanse that seemed to breathe with the wind, swelling and subsiding in great slow waves that travelled outward toward the unseen horizon. Here and there, at intervals of perhaps a mile or more, the silhouette of a lone cottonwood tree rose against the pale sky, its branches twisted by the prevailing winds into fantastical shapes that the imagination might read as crouching figures or sleeping giants. The slow gestures of dancers frozen mid-motion. The cottonwoods grew chiefly along the small stream beds that wound their way across the prairie, and where you saw a cottonwood you knew that water lay nearby. Perhaps a thin creek of cold, clear water flowing over a bed of pale stones. The native peoples of the region, the Pawnee and the Sioux and the Cheyenne, had long marked their journeys by these solitary trees, and the early surveyors of the railroad had often used them as landmarks when laying out the route. Beyond the cottonwoods, occasional small dark mounds rose from the grass, the sleeping forms of a herd of cattle bedded down for the night upon some open range. The longhorns of the era were lean, hardy creatures, descendants of the Spanish cattle that had escaped from missions in Texas a century before, and they had adapted with remarkable success to the harsh climate of the open plains. By moonlight, their coats appeared a uniform pale silver, and their long curving horns caught small glints of light along their polished tips. They lay in loose constellations upon the grass, perhaps 40 or 50 animals to a group, watched over by a single weary cowboy somewhere in the distance who would tend them until dawn. Far to the south, almost at the edge of vision, a small orange spark glowed against the dark earth, the campfire of some traveller or some homesteader, or perhaps a small encampment of cowboys gathered around their evening coffee. The fire was so distant that it appeared no larger than a single pinprick of light, but its warmth and its meaning were unmistakable. For upon the prairie of 1880 every small fire was a small island of human company in an ocean of solitude. Then the sight of it from your moving window evoked a quiet kinship with whoever sat beside it now, sharing this same vast night sky from a vantage point so different from your own. Above the prairie, the stars themselves had begun to emerge in their slow ceremonial procession, and on a clear summer night such as this they appeared in numbers that the city dwellers of our own century can scarcely imagine. The Milky Way arched across the heavens from horizon to horizon, a great silver river of countless suns, dense with star clouds and dark dust lanes that the astronomers of the age were only beginning to map. The constellations were sharper here, brighter, more numerous, undimmed by any electric light, for the only artificial illumination upon the entire prairie was the headlamp of your locomotive and the small oil lamps of distant farmhouses, and these did little to compete with the splendour overhead. The North Star hung steady and faithful at its accustomed bearing, and the great curved sweep of the Big Dipper pointed toward it as it had pointed for travellers since long before the invention of any rail or any wheel. The sound of the night beyond the window came to you only faintly, muffled by the double-paned glass and the carriage's heavy insulation. But if you listened with patient attention, you might detect the distant call of a coyote somewhere far across the grass, a long, lonely, melodic cry that rose and fell in 3 or 4 notes before fading into silence. Other coyotes, hearing it, would answer from other directions, and a slow conversation of these wild dogs would unfold across miles of prairie, each animal speaking in its turn, and then a deep and patient quiet would settle once more upon the land. Closer at hand, you might hear the occasional rush of wind passing along the carriage's exterior, gusting briefly against the storm panes and then easing again. The wind upon the prairie was a constant companion, sometimes gentle as a sleeping breath, sometimes fierce enough to bend the grass nearly flat, but tonight it blew softly from the south, warm with the residual heat of the day, carrying upon it the faint herbal scent of sage and the dry sweet aroma of cured grass and the cool earthy perfume of the small streams that wound through the distant valleys. The horizon itself, that line where earth met sky, was barely distinguishable in the moonlight, and the whole landscape seemed to dissolve gradually into the heavens, the prairie blurring upward into the stars and the stars dissolving downward into the grass, so that the world appeared as a single continuous fabric of soft silver and deep blue, gently undulating, gently breathing. The carriage moved through this sleeping world at perhaps 30 miles each hour, and the landscape unspooled past your window like a slowly turning panorama in some great dim picture house of the imagination, each scene replaced by another, each moment giving way to the next without hurry, without resistance, without any intervention required of you. You had only to sit and to watch and to allow the prairie to pass through your awareness as gently as it passed beyond the glass. The grasses rolled, the cottonwoods leaned, the cattle slept, the coyotes called, the stars wheeled in their slow ancient courses, and the train moved faithfully onward through the great soft heart of the continent, carrying you with it toward whatever distant morning lay waiting beyond the unseen curve of the earth. Let us drift forward now gently through the soft passage of the night, past the long quiet hours when most of the carriage lay asleep behind drawn curtains, and arrive together at that slow tender moment when the eastern sky first began to lighten. The dawn upon the prairie of 1880 did not arrive abruptly, as it sometimes seems to arrive in cities crowded with buildings that hide the horizon, but rather emerged in long gradients of colour, the deepest indigo at the zenith fading downward through soft violet and rose and pale apricot until it met the dark line of the earth itself. The first true light came perhaps an hour before the sun, when the stars began to fade one by one in the western sky, and the silhouettes of distant grasses gained a faint definition against the slowly warming horizon. Within the carriage, the porter was already awake, had indeed been awake since perhaps 4 in the morning, moving through the dim corridor with the silent grace that long practice had taught him. He carried in one hand a small brass tray bearing a polished pot of fresh coffee, and in the other a folded white towel draped over his arm in the manner of a fine restaurant waiter. The aroma of the coffee preceded him gently down the aisle, a rich, dark fragrance of beans roasted some days before in the great Pullman commissary kitchens of Chicago and ground that very morning in a small hand-cranked mill at the rear of the parlor car. The coffee itself was brewed in the percolator method then favored by railway service, the water rising through a small central tube and falling repeatedly through the grounds within a perforated basket, so that with each cycle the brew grew deeper and richer until the porter judged it ready by the dark amber color visible through the small glass dome at the percolator's top. As the dawn light strengthened beyond the windows, the porter began his morning ritual of unfastening the heavy serge curtains of those passengers who had requested an early call. He would approach a curtained berth, pause briefly, clear his throat in the most discreet manner possible, and then murmur a soft "Good morning, sir," or "Good morning, madam," followed by the announcement of the present hour, and a gentle inquiry as to whether coffee or tea would be preferred. The passenger within would stir, sometimes mumbling a sleepy reply, sometimes asking for another quarter-hour's rest, and the porter would nod and move on to the next berth, his presence so unobtrusive that the rest of the car continued to sleep undisturbed. In the small lavatory at the end of the carriage, the porter had already prepared the morning toilette accommodations with the practised thoroughness of his profession. The marble-topped washstand had been wiped clean, the porcelain basin scrubbed and rinsed, and a fresh pitcher of warm water set upon the small shelf beside it. The water had been heated upon the small stove in the porter's pantry, drawn from the carriage's holding tanks, and tested with a bare hand to ensure its temperature was comfortable but not scalding. Beside the basin lay a small tray of toiletries provided by the Pullman Company, a cake of fine French milled soap scented with violet, several small linen hand towels embroidered with the company crest, a comb of polished horn, and a small cut-glass flaken of bay rum cologne for the gentlemen who wished to refresh themselves after shaving. The mirror above the washstand was framed in the same dark mahogany as the rest of the carriage, and it had been polished that morning with a soft chamois cloth, so that it reflected the dawnlight cleanly without streak or smudge. Small gas-lit sconce on either side cast a warm, steady glow that supplemented the growing daylight from the small frosted window above the basin, a window through which the morning prairie revealed itself in soft impressionistic blurs of gold and green. For shaving, a gentleman might bring his own razor and brush, but the carriage also kept a small cabinet of razors maintained by the porter, each one stropped to a fine edge, each one laid upon a clean white cloth for the use of any traveller who had not packed his own. The shaving soap was a hard-milled cake of tallow and lavender, and the brush was of fine badger hair, soft and full, and the lather it produced was thick and creamy, and held its warmth for the full duration of a careful shave. A man could enter the lavatory with his face dark with the night's growth and emerge 10 minutes later, smooth-cheeked and refreshed, his collar buttoned, his cravat tied, his hair smoothed with a touch of bay rum cologne. For ladies, of course, the morning toilette was a more private and elaborate affair, and most preferred to refresh themselves within the curtained privacy of their own berths, rather than in the common lavatory. The porter would deliver a small basin of warm water and a clean linen towel directly to the berth, accompanied by a fresh glass of cold water for drinking and a small porcelain tray bearing a pot of coffee or tea according to the lady's preference. Within the berth, the lady would unfasten the small toiletry case she had brought aboard, perhaps a fitted leather valise containing her hairbrushes, her hairpins, her small bottles of toilet water and lavender oil, and would proceed at her own gentle pace through the rituals of the morning. In the parlour section of the carriage, meanwhile, the daytime configuration was being slowly restored. As each pair of berths was vacated, the porter would return to remove the linens, fold and stow the bedding, raise the upper berth back into its concealed position against the ceiling, and reassemble the velvet seats in their daytime parlour arrangement. The transformation was unhurried, conducted in such a way that no passenger needed to feel rushed, and yet by perhaps 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, the entire carriage had once again assumed its daytime aspect of a moving drawing-room, with all evidence of the night's slumber tucked discreetly away. The coffee that had been brewing since before dawn was now served in delicate porcelain cups upon small saucers of matching pattern, and these were carried by the porter to each passenger as they emerged into the parlour. The porcelain itself was of fine quality, perhaps from the Lamberton factory in New Jersey or imported from Limoges in France, and it bore the small Pullman crest in gold leaf along the rim. To hold such a cup in one's hand on a dawn morning aboard a moving train, with the prairie unfurling outside the window in the soft golden light of a new day, was to participate in a small ceremony of civilized travel that the citizens of the era considered one of the great refinements of their age. Alongside the coffee, the porter offered small plates bearing a selection of breakfast pastries baked early that morning in the dining car ahead. There were buttery croissants in the French manner, soft rolls glazed with a thin sugar wash, small biscuits of buttermilk and lard, and slices of dense pound cake studded with currants. The aroma of these pastries mingled with the coffee, drifted through the parlour in waves of warm sweetness, and the passengers, settling into their accustomed seats, lifted their cups, gazed out at the brightening world, and prepared themselves with quiet contentment for another long day of journey. Allow yourself now to rise from your velvet seat slowly and without strain, and to walk the gentle length of the corridor toward the dining car that lies just 2 carriages ahead. The transition between cars was, in 1880, accomplished by means of a small enclosed vestibule, a feature relatively new to American railroading and one that George Pullman had championed as a great improvement in passenger comfort. Before the vestibule's introduction, travellers had been forced to step across an open gap between cars, exposed to the wind and weather and the alarming sight of the rails rushing past beneath their feet. Now, however, the vestibule provided a small enclosed chamber with accordion folds of heavy canvas that bridged the gap, sealing the passage from the elements, and allowing one to walk from car to car as comfortably as one might walk between the rooms of a fine hotel. The dining car, when you entered it, revealed itself as a place of considerable ceremony and refinement, designed to evoke the atmosphere of an exclusive gentleman's club or a grand hotel restaurant rather than the rough utilitarian eating houses that had characterized earlier railway travel. The walls were panelled in a richer, darker mahogany than the parlour cars, with raised panels bordered by carved beadings, and the upper portion of each wall above the wainscot was finished in a deep crimson silk damask that absorbed sound and lent the room a quiet, dignified atmosphere. The ceiling was painted in pale ivory with delicate gilt detailing, and at intervals along its length hung small etched glass chandeliers fitted with multiple gas burners, each chandelier producing a warm, bright pool of light that illuminated the tables below. The tables themselves were arranged in 2 rows along the length of the car, each table set for either 2 or 4 diners and covered with a tablecloth of finest white damask, woven in a small pattern of laurel leaves visible only when the light caught it at the proper angle. Upon each cloth were arranged the implements of formal dining, a heavy silver-plated charger plate at each setting, atop which the porcelain dinner plate would later be placed, flanked by an array of silver flatware in the proper sequence from outside to inside. There were oyster forks and fish forks and salad forks and dinner forks upon the left, and an answering progression of spoons and knives upon the right, and above each plate a smaller dessert spoon and a butter knife laid horizontally. The silverware was of silver-plated nickel, polished daily by the dining car staff, and each piece bore the small embossed Pullman crest along its handle. To the right of each plate stood a constellation of stemmed glassware, a tall water goblet of slightly bluish hue, a smaller wineglass of clear crystal, and beside it a smaller still cordial glass for the sweet liqueurs that often concluded a fine meal. The glassware was of American manufacture, perhaps from the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company or the New England Glass Company, and although it was not the finest crystal of European origin, it was nevertheless of excellent quality and rang with a clear tone when struck gently with a fingernail. A small silver salt cellar with its tiny silver spoon stood at the centre of each table, accompanied by a pepper caster of matching design, and a small-footed dish of unsalted butter rolled into small spheres upon a bed of crushed ice. The menu offered to diners in 1880 was, by the standards of the era, remarkably elaborate, considering that all of it had to be prepared within the small kitchen at the rear of the dining car upon a coal-fired range, no larger than that of a modest farmhouse. Yet the dining car chefs of the Pullman service were men of considerable training, often Frenchmen or German immigrants who had learned their craft in the great hotels of New York or Chicago before taking employment with the railroad, and they performed feats of culinary art within their cramped quarters that astonished the passengers seated 30 feet away. Typical breakfast might begin with fresh fruit in season, perhaps sliced peaches in summer or stewed prunes and apricots in winter, served in small-footed cups of cut crystal. Then would follow a course of broiled trout taken from cold mountain streams the previous day and packed in ice within the dining car's refrigerator, served with lemon wedges and small sprigs of parsley. Eggs followed, prepared to each passenger's preference, scrambled, fried, poached upon toast or made into delicate omelettes folded around fillings of mushroom or ham or fine herbs. Alongside the eggs came rashers of bacon cured by some Iowa farmer, slices of ham from the great Cincinnati packing houses, or sausages of the kind the Germans called bratwurst, plump and aromatic with sage and pepper. For the more elaborate luncheon and dinner services, the menu expanded considerably. There might be soups of consommé or cream of celery, served from large silver tureens that the waiter ladled at tableside. The fish course offered fresh oysters on the half-shell when the train was within range of the coast, or planked whitefish from the Great Lakes when travelling through the upper Midwest. The main course might be a roast of beef carved by the chef himself at a small carving station near the kitchen, or saddle of venison in a wine-based sauce, or roasted prairie chicken with a stuffing of cornbread and chestnuts. Vegetables appeared in glazed silver dishes, creamed potatoes whipped to a soft peak, baby carrots glazed with butter and sugar, asparagus served warm with hollandaise sauce, or buttered beets cut into small dice. The desserts were a particular pride of the Pullman dining service, and the pastry chef worked with as much skill as the savoury cook to produce a daily array of tarts, pies, puddings, and ice creams. There might be apple pie with a lattice crust, lemon meringue with peaks browned to a perfect golden amber, blancmange of almond milk and gelatin set in fluted moulds, or vanilla ice cream churned in the small hand-cranked freezer in the dining car's pantry, sweetened with honey and flavoured with a real vanilla bean from Madagascar. Coffee followed in delicate cups accompanied by small dishes of after-dinner mince and candied ginger. The waiters who served these meals moved between the tables with the practised grace of men who had performed these duties hundreds of times. They wore short white jackets buttoned high to the throat, black bow ties and dark trousers, and at their belts they carried small white napkins folded in the precise manner taught by the senior steward. They poured water without spilling a drop, despite the constant gentle motion of the carriage, and they presented each plate with a small flourish of the wrist, setting it before the diner so that the principal item faced him squarely. The atmosphere of the dining car at the dinner hour was one of subdued conviviality. The murmur of conversation softened by the heavy fabrics and carpets, the gentle clink of silver against porcelain, the occasional quiet laugh of a lady at her companion's wit, and the soft, clear tone of the wine glasses as they were lifted in toasts, Outside the windows, the prairie or the mountain or the river valley rolled past in the light of the lowering sun, painting the diners and their meals in shifting hues of gold and amber and deep rose. To eat in such a place, with such food, with such company, while the great American continent unfolded beyond the glass at 30 miles each hour, was to participate in one of the most quietly remarkable experiences that the 19th century could offer to the traveller. Now allow yourself to drift back through the corridor to the parlour car once more, and to settle into a different seat than before, perhaps a deep wing-backed armchair near the small marble-top table that stands between the windows. The afternoon hours aboard the carriage possessed a particular quality of their own, distinct from the busy mornings and the elaborate evenings. A long, slow expanse of time in which the passengers settled into the gentle rhythms of leisure that defined the civilized travel of the era. There were no telegrams to answer here, no urgent business letters to compose, no schedules to check obsessively against the ticking of clocks. The train would arrive when it arrived, and the hours between were given over to the pleasant arts of reading, conversation, needlework, correspondence, and the slow taking of tea. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the porter began the ceremony of afternoon tea, a ritual borrowed from the British custom that had become firmly established aboard the Pullman service by the late 1870s. He would emerge from the small pantry at the carriage's rear bearing a large silver tray, polished to a brilliance that caught the afternoon light and scattered it in soft glints across the mahogany ceiling. Upon the tray rested a tall silver teapot of the kind called a Russian samovar style, its handle wrapped in cool ivory to protect the hand of the pourer, its long curved spout designed to deliver a steady stream of perfectly heated tea into each waiting cup. Beside the teapot stood a smaller silver pot of hot water for diluting the tea according to the drinker's preference, a covered silver dish of milk, a small pitcher of cream, a silver bowl of cube sugar with its tiny silver tongs, and a small saucer of thin lemon slices cut so finely that the light passed through them as though through frosted glass. The tea itself was a fine Ceylon blend, supplied to the Pullman Company by one of the great tea importers of New York or Boston, and brewed in the proper English manner with water brought to a rolling boil and poured over the leaves at the precise moment the boil began. The teapot had been warmed beforehand with a small amount of hot water, then emptied and filled with the proper measure of leaves before the boiling water was added, and the brew had been allowed to steep for exactly 4 minutes before the porter brought it forth. The resulting tea was deep amber in colour, fragrant with a slightly malty aroma, and possessed of a body and complexity that even the most particular British colonial would have approved. Accompanying the tea came an array of small cakes and savouries arranged upon a 3-tiered silver stand. Upon the lowest tier rested small triangular sandwiches with their crusts removed, filled variously with thinly sliced cucumber and butter, with watercress and cream cheese, with smoked salmon and dill, or with thin curls of roast beef dressed with a touch of horseradish cream. The middle tier bore a selection of scones freshly baked that afternoon in the dining car kitchen, served warm and accompanied by small pots of strawberry jam, lemon curd and clotted cream that had been kept cool in the pantry refrigerator until the moment of service. The upper tier presented a small selection of fancy cakes, petit fours iced in pale pink and lemon yellow, miniature lemon tarts with their tops glazed to a brilliant translucence, small almond macaroons sandwiched together with raspberry preserves, and tiny eclairs filled with vanilla cream and dipped in dark chocolate. The passengers gathered for tea in small loose groupings around the parlour car, some at the small marble-topped tables, some upon the velvet sofas, some in the deep armchairs near the windows. Conversations rose and fell in quiet currents throughout the carriage, blending with the gentle clink of porcelain and the soft creak of the wooden panelling. A gentleman of some 50 years, dressed in a frock coat of dark wool with a small chain of gold linking his pocket watch to its chain, might be discussing with a neighbor the progress of a new mining venture in the territories of Colorado or Nevada. 2 ladies seated near the front of the carriage, both wearing the high-necked blouses and the long full skirts that fashion required, might be exchanging gentle observations about a recent novel by Mr. Henry James, or perhaps the latest installment of a serialized story in Harper's Weekly. Small boy of perhaps 8 years, seated beside his mother at one of the central tables, would be engaged in the slow, patient work of finishing his slice of cake with a small silver fork, while his mother gently corrected his posture or adjusted the small white napkin upon his lap. The mother was a young woman of perhaps 30, travelling westward to join her husband in a newly built homestead in the Wyoming Territory, and her dress, though simple in cut, was made of a fine cotton lawn printed with small sprays of forget-me-nots and edged at the sleeves with a narrow band of cream lace. Her face bore the soft mixture of hope and weariness common to such travellers of her era, and the gentle hour of tea was a respite she savoured with quiet appreciation. In another corner of the parlour, an elderly gentleman with a long silver beard and a small pair of gold-rimmed spectacles sat reading a leather-bound copy of Mr. Mark Twain's recent Roughing It, the book that had been published some 8 years before but which had become the favoured reading of westbound travellers. He turned the pages slowly, paused often to gaze out at the passing landscape, and occasionally let out a small soft chuckle at some particularly apt observation by the author. Beside him on the small table rested his cup of tea, growing slowly cold as he became absorbed in his reading, and the porter, passing by some minutes later, would discreetly replace it with a fresh hot cup without disturbing the gentleman's concentration. The conversation, where it arose, was conducted in low cultivated tones suitable to the refined atmosphere of the carriage. There were no raised voices here, no boisterous laughter, no coarse expressions that might have offended the more genteel ears in the company. Young couple, perhaps newlyweds, travelling on their wedding journey westward to settle in San Francisco, spoke softly together near the window, their hands occasionally meeting briefly upon the table as they shared some small private observation. An older lady in widow's mourning dress of black bombazine sat alone with a small tatting shuttle, her fingers moving in the practised rhythm that produced the delicate lace that would border some future linen handkerchief or pillow slip. Outside the windows the afternoon light had grown long and golden, and the prairie or the foothills or the river valley through which the train was passing took on the warm honeyed quality that photographers of the era called the magic hour. The shadows of cottonwood trees stretched eastward across the grass, and the distant horizon glowed with the soft amber of approaching sunset. The teapot was refilled, the cakes were replenished, the conversations continued in their slow patient currents, and the train rolled faithfully onward through the long quiet afternoon. If you would, dear traveller, allow your imagination to wander now toward the rear of the train, 2 cars behind the parlour in which we have lingered, where you would find a particular carriage reserved for those passengers who wish to engage in the masculine pastimes considered unsuitable for the mixed company of the parlour cars. This was the smoking lounge, sometimes combined with a small library in the more elaborately appointed trains, and it represented a kind of moving gentleman's club, a place of dark wood and deep leather, and the slow blue curl of fine cigar smoke rising toward the gilded ceiling. The walls of the smoking lounge were panelled in a darker wood than the parlour cars, a deep walnut so heavily oiled that it appeared almost black except where the gas lamps caught its grain and revealed the slow swirling patterns within. The ceiling above was painted in a rich tobacco brown with gilt detailing that traced its way along the cornices in patterns of laurel leaves and small classical urns. The floor was covered not in carpet but in a heavy linoleum patterned to resemble inlaid wood, easier to clean than carpet of the ash and small spills that inevitably accumulated in such a room, and worn smooth by the slow passage of countless leather-soled shoes. The furniture of the lounge consisted of deep leather armchairs and small leather upholstered settees, all in a rich ox-blood colour that had darkened over the years of use to a deep mahogany tone. The leather had been oiled regularly with a saddle soap that left it supple and faintly fragrant, with the warm scent of well-tended hide, and the small brass tacks that secured the upholstery to the wooden frames had developed the soft patina that brass acquires only through long contact with the air. Each chair stood upon a small set of casters that allowed it to be moved easily, and beside each chair rested a small smoking table of the same dark walnut, fitted with a brass ashtray, a small ceramic spittoon, a holder for a glass of refreshment, and a small brass match safe containing a supply of long wooden matches. Upon entering the lounge, you would be greeted by the particular atmosphere of a room dedicated to the pleasures of tobacco. The air carried a complex bouquet of scents that the cigar enthusiasts of the era recognized and appreciated: the rich, earthy aroma of fine Cuban tobacco, the slightly sweet undertone of the Connecticut wrapper leaf, the lingering ghost of countless cigars smoked in this same room over many previous journeys, and beneath it all the faint, clean smell of the leather upholstery and the polished wood. To the modern nose this might seem an oppressive atmosphere, but to the gentleman of 1880 it was the very perfume of refined relaxation, as familiar and as welcoming as the scent of a kitchen at supper time. Small humidor of polished cedar stood near the entrance, attended by a porter whose specific responsibility it was to maintain the proper temperature and humidity for the cigars within. The humidor contained a selection of fine cigars suitable to the tastes of the discerning travellers: hand-rolled Havanas in their cedar boxes, the famous Henry Clay brand, the equally celebrated Romeo y Julieta, alongside domestic American cigars of fine quality from the manufacturers in Tampa and Key West, where Cuban refugees had established their craft in recent decades. Gentlemen who wished to smoke might select a cigar from the humidor, accept a small cedar spill lit at one of the lamp's flames, and proceed to light his cigar in the proper manner, holding the flame just below the foot of the cigar and rotating it slowly while drawing gentle puffs to ensure an even burn. For pipe smokers, a small selection of fine pipe tobaccos rested in glass-lidded jars upon a small shelf beside the humidor. There was a Virginia flake, golden brown and sweet, an English Navy mixture of Latakia and Perique, a Cavendish blend pressed and sweetened with rum and honey, and an aromatic mixture of Burley and black Cavendish flavoured with vanilla and cherry. A gentleman would draw forth his own pipe, fill its bowl with the tobacco of his preference, tamp it gently with the small brass tamper that hung from his watch chain, and light it with one of the long wooden matches. The library portion of the carriage, set off from the smoking area by a small archway draped with a heavy curtain, contained perhaps 300 volumes ranged along the walls in floor-to-ceiling bookcases of the same dark walnut. The books had been selected by the Pullman Company with care, intended to provide reading suitable to the tastes of an educated traveller upon a long journey. There were the standard works of English literature in their handsome calf-bound editions, the complete works of Shakespeare, the novels of Walter Scott and Charles Dickens, the poetry of Tennyson and Browning. There were the great American authors of the day: Mr. Longfellow's collected poems, the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the more recent novels of Mr. William Dean Howells. There were practical works for the traveller, a complete set of the Appleton's Railway Guide, several editions of Bradshaw's, the various publications of the Geological Survey describing the regions through which the train might pass. There were geographies and natural histories, illustrated volumes describing the flora and fauna of the American West, large folio editions of John James Audubon's birds with their hand-tinted plates protected by sheets of tissue paper. There were classics in their leather bindings: Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 6 volumes, Plutarch's Lives in 2, Boswell's Life of Johnson, Marcus Aurelius, and the Meditations of Epictetus. The bookcases themselves were fitted with small brass rails along the front of each shelf, designed to prevent the books from sliding forward when the train rounded a curve, and beside each bookcase stood a small reading table with a comfortable armchair, a green-shaded reading lamp. Tanned, a small bell to summon the porter for refreshment. Gentlemen might select a volume from the shelves, settle into the chair, light his cigar, signal for a glass of brandy, and pass several quiet hours of reading while the American continent rolled past the windows beyond. The conversation in the smoking lounge tended to be more relaxed than in the parlour car, more inclined to the discussion of business matters, of politics, of the latest news from the great cities of the East. Gentlemen who had never met before might find themselves engaged in earnest conversation over their cigars, exchanging opinions on the gold standard, the latest doings of President Hayes or the recently elected James Garfield, the prospects for the silver mines of Leadville, the fortunes of the cattle ranches in Wyoming and Montana. A young man returning to his family business in Denver might be educated by an elderly judge from Boston upon the finer points of railroad financing. Two cattlemen, meeting by chance, might discover they shared common acquaintances among the great ranches of Texas. And throughout these slow hours of smoke and drink and conversation, the train moved faithfully onward. The leather creaked gently in its frames, the lamps cast their warm pools of light, the books waited patiently upon their shelves, the air grew slowly thicker with the rich blue haze of fine tobacco quietly enjoyed in the company of fellow travellers upon the long road westward. Listen now, dear traveller, with that gentle attention which sleep itself begins to coax from the senses. Listen to the soundscape of the carriage, the layered fabric of small audible textures that surrounded the passengers of 1880 in every waking and sleeping hour of their journey. We have spoken of sights and scents and tactile sensations, but to truly enter the world of the Pullman carriage one must understand its music, the slow patient symphony of mechanical and human and natural sounds that blended together into the unmistakable acoustic signature of railway travel in that distant golden age. Beneath all other sounds, the foundation of the carriage's audible world was the steady rhythm of the wheels passing over the rails. This was not the continuous hum of a modern welded rail, but rather a measured cadence of clicks. The small percussive notes produced as each wheel crossed the small gap between one rail length and the next. The rails of 1880 were typically 30 feet in length, joined together at their ends by metal fish plates that left a small intentional gap to allow for thermal expansion. As each wheel of each truck passed over each joint, it produced a small, clear click, and because each truck had two axles, spaced perhaps 8 feet apart, and because the train ran at perhaps 30 miles per hour, the clicks arrived in a particular characteristic pattern that the passengers came to know as well as their own heartbeats. Listen now to that pattern. Click-clack, 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 the first click slightly louder as the leading axle passed the joint, the second click slightly softer as the trailing axle followed a moment later. The interval between the pairs was longer than the interval within each pair, producing a syncopated rhythm that musicians of a later century would recognize as a kind of railroad shuffle. Within the carriage, this rhythm reached the ear muffled by the heavy carpets and the thick insulation, transmuted from a sharp metallic clicking into a soft warm pulse that seemed almost to come from beneath the floor itself, like the slow heartbeat of some great patient creature carrying the carriage upon its broad back. Above this foundational rhythm rose the various creaks and small movements of the wooden carriage itself. The seasoned mahogany and walnut and oak of the construction were never entirely silent, for the wood continued to flex very slightly with the movements of the train, with changes in temperature and humidity, with the small twisting forces that any long wooden vehicle experiences as it traverses curves and gradients. These movements produced a quiet conversation of small creaks and soft pops, a language of wood that the regular travellers came to find as comforting as the murmurs of a familiar old house. A particular panel near the dining car door might creak softly each time the train rounded a left-hand curve, and a regular passenger might smile slightly upon hearing it, recognizing an old friend. The brass fittings of the carriage contributed their own small sounds to the ensemble. The small chains suspending the lamps from the ceiling rang faintly against themselves as the train rocked, producing a tiny silvery tinkle barely above the threshold of hearing. The brass coat hooks along the corridor walls swayed gently and tapped against the wood behind them. The cut-glass pendants of the larger ceiling lamps clinked together with a soft musical chime whenever the carriage swayed through a curve, and this chime was so quiet, so brief, so delicate, that the passengers often were not consciously aware of it, but registered it only as an indefinable shimmer of pleasantness in the surrounding air. From the world beyond the carriage came the muffled sounds of locomotive and landscape. The whistle of the engine was the most distinctive of these, a long melodic cry produced by steam forced through the brass whistle pipe, with a tone that the engineers had carefully tuned to a particular interval, often a simple major chord that carried for miles across the open country. The whistle sounded in particular patterns to communicate information. 2 long blasts to signal departure, 1 long and 1 short to signal approach to a road crossing, 3 short to indicate that the engineer was applying the brakes. To the passengers within the carriage, the whistle arrived as a softened, distant cry, beautiful and a little melancholy, the very voice of the great American railway in its golden age. The bell of the locomotive, mounted just behind the smokestack, rang continuously when the train approached stations or crossed through populated areas. Its tone was a single deep, clear note, struck by a small mechanical hammer attached to a rope that the engineer or fireman could pull from the cab. The bell's voice travelled through the air with a different quality than the whistle's, more rounded, more sustained, and within the carriage it arrived as a soft, regular pulse, like the bell of a distant village church on a quiet afternoon. The wind itself, rushing along the carriage's exterior at 30 miles each hour, produced a low, soft hum that varied in pitch and intensity as the train moved through different landscapes. In open country, the wind sound was a steady murmur, low and constant. When the train passed through a cutting between two hills, the sound briefly intensified as the wind compressed in the narrower space. When it crossed a long bridge, the sound thinned and became more hollow as the wind rushed beneath the train as well as around it. These small variations in the wind's voice provided the attentive listener with a kind of audible map of the surrounding terrain, audible even from within the heavily insulated carriage. Within the carriage itself, the sounds of human presence wove themselves through the mechanical and natural sounds. The murmur of conversation rose and fell in soft currents, the rustle of newspapers being folded and unfolded, the clink of porcelain teacups settling onto saucers, the soft click of knitting needles in the hands of a lady working upon a small piece of needlework, the quiet pages of a book being turned, the low laugh of a gentleman amused by his companion's wit, the slow, even breathing of a child asleep upon his mother's lap. All of these sounds blended into the larger fabric of the carriage's audible world, each one small and individual, but together composing a portrait of human community on a long journey together. Occasionally, a true musical sound would rise above the rest. In some carriages, a small upright piano stood at one end of the parlour, and at certain hours a passenger with musical inclination might sit before it and play some quiet piece. The notes of a Chopin nocturne or a gentle Stephen Foster melody would drift through the carriage, blending with the rhythm of the wheels and the murmur of conversation, and the passengers would pause briefly in their reading or their conversation to listen, smile, and then resume their quiet activities with the music as a soft accompaniment. Together, all of these sounds composed the slow lullaby of the long-distance railway journey, a music written not by any single composer but by the entire civilization that had built and operated this remarkable system. Then the passengers who allowed themselves to be carried by it could feel themselves drifting into a state of profound and peaceful contentment. Among the many travellers aboard the carriage, there were always a few small souls whose experience of the journey was utterly different from that of the adults around them, and whose presence lent a particular quiet sweetness to the long days and nights of westward travel. The children aboard the Pullman carriage of 1880 were generally the offspring of families relocating to new homes in the West, or perhaps the youngsters of well-to-do parents travelling for pleasure or for the visiting of relatives in distant cities. Then their experience of the train was one of wonder, of constant fascination, of memories that would remain vivid throughout the whole of their lives. Consider, if you will, a small girl of perhaps 6 years of age travelling with her mother and her younger brother from Pittsburgh toward Sacramento, where her father had established a successful wholesale grocery business some 18 months before. Her name might be Eleanor, and she might be wearing a small dress of pale blue cotton, smocked across the bodice in a pattern of tiny flowers, with white stockings and small black buttoned boots whose laces her mother had tied with particular care that morning. Her hair would be drawn back from her face and tied with a wide ribbon of darker blue, and she would carry, clutched against her chest, small cloth doll named Penelope, whom she had received as a Christmas gift the previous year, and from whom she had not been parted for any meaningful period of time since. For Eleanor, the carriage was a place of endless small wonders. The brass fittings, polished to such a shine that she could see her own face reflected in them, fascinated her. She would press her small face very close to a brass coat hook and watch herself stare back, her features distorted by the curving surface, her own eyes enormous and her own nose somehow merging with her cheeks. She would press her finger against the cut-glass lampshade and feel its faceted surface, marveling at the way it seemed to multiply her single fingertip into a dozen tiny fingertips arranged in a circle. She would crouch upon the burgundy carpet and trace its acanthus leaf pattern with her finger, following the design from one end of the corridor to the other, discovering small variations she had not noticed before. Her younger brother, a boy of perhaps 3 years, was more interested in the sounds and motions of the carriage. He pressed his small face against the window and watched the world pass by, exclaiming with delight whenever a horse or a cow or a flock of birds came into view. He would imitate the sound of the train whistle, pursing his small lips and producing a thin, high woo-woo that occasionally drew indulgent smiles from the surrounding passengers. He would clap his small hands together in time with the click-clack of the wheels, and his mother would gently still his hands when his enthusiasm grew too vigorous. The mother of these two small travellers was a young woman of perhaps 28, dressed in a travelling costume of dark grey wool with small touches of black braid along the cuffs and collar, her hair drawn up beneath a small bonnet of black straw trimmed with grey ribbon. She carried in her lap a cloth bag containing the necessities of child tending, a small hairbrush for tidying disordered curls, a clean handkerchief for wiping away the small spills and mishaps of the journey, a few small picture books for moments of restless boredom, small bag of sugared almonds to be doled out as occasional rewards for good behaviour. Her face wore the patient half-smile of a young mother who has been travelling for several days with 2 small children and who has reached that gentle plateau of weariness where small disturbances no longer ruffle her composure. The Pullman Company had developed, over the years of its operation, certain accommodations specifically intended to make the journey easier for families with children. The porter would bring small cushions to elevate a child's seat to the level of the dining table, and would carry a small footstool from carriage to carriage if a child was unable to climb the steps unassisted. The dining car kept a separate small menu for children featuring simpler dishes of buttered noodles, small chicken pies, soft-cooked eggs, milk toasts, and rice puddings, and the chef would prepare these without complaint regardless of how many such requests arrived during a given service. Small enamelled cups with handles on both sides were kept in the pantry for the use of small drinkers, along with small silver spoons sized for small hands. In the parlour car, certain small entertainments were provided for the amusement of children during the long hours when the landscape outside the window grew tedious. There was a small wooden box containing carved animal figures, tiny horses, cows, sheep, dogs, cats, and a few exotic creatures such as elephants and lions, all painted in bright colours and arranged within the box in their proper compartments. Children could be invited to take them out and play with them upon the floor, arranging them in small farms or zoos or imaginary kingdoms, and then carefully returning them to their compartments when their play was concluded. There was a small wooden frame containing a strung set of coloured wooden beads that could be slid back and forth, a kind of abacus that served the dual purpose of a counting toy and a soothing fidget for restless small hands. There was a kaleidoscope of polished brass with multiple cylinders of coloured glass that produced ever-shifting patterns of brilliant geometric beauty when held up to the light and slowly rotated. There were a few small picture books of nursery rhymes illustrated in the coloured chromolithography that had become possible only in the previous decade, depicting little Bo Peep with her sheep, and little Miss Muffet with her spider in soft rose and pale yellow and gentle blue. The other passengers in the parlour, the elderly ladies and the businessmen and the young couples, regarded these small travellers with a generally indulgent affection. Children were a precious presence aboard a long journey, a reminder of innocence and futurity and the renewal of human life that lent meaning to all the labour of building this great railroad and crossing this great continent. An elderly gentleman might pull a small candy from his waistcoat pocket and offer it with a smile to a passing child. A young woman might compliment a mother on the prettiness of her daughter's dress. An older lady might engage a small boy in gentle conversation about his favourite colour or his cherished pet, treating him with the small dignified attention that children remember all their lives. And so the small travellers passed their days aboard the carriage, in a world of endless small wonders, surrounded by the gentle attentions of their families and their fellow passengers, lulled to sleep each night by the same gentle rocking of the rails that lulled the adults around them. dreaming small bright dreams as the train carried them westward through the great patient night. Allow your imagination now to drift toward those quieter corners of the train's operation that lay beyond the awareness of most passengers, and yet which formed essential threads in the great web of communication that the railroad had woven across the American continent. Behind the passenger cars, in a specially fitted carriage of utilitarian design, there worked a small company of postal clerks whose labours connected every farmstead and every village along the route to every other settlement in the nation, and whose service represented one of the great, if largely unsung, achievements of the 19th century American Republic. The railway mail service, formally established in 1864 during the latter years of the Civil War, had by 1880 grown into a sophisticated and remarkably efficient operation. The mail car, called by the railwaymen an RPO or Railway Post Office, was a specially designed carriage some 60 feet in length, painted in the dark green of the United States Post Office Department and lettered along its sides with the words U.S. Mail Railway Post Office in golden serif type. Within the car, the entire interior was given over to the rapid sorting and processing of mail in transit, allowing letters posted in St. Louis on a Tuesday morning to be delivered in San Francisco on a Friday afternoon, feat of communication that would have seemed magical to the citizens of the previous generation. The interior of the mail car was lined along both walls with a long rank of pigeonhole sorting cases, each pigeonhole labelled with the name of a particular town, county, or postal route somewhere along the train's journey. There were perhaps 400 pigeonholes in total, arranged in geometric patterns that the mail clerks had memorized in such complete detail that they could place a letter in its proper hole without consciously reading the label, simply by the developed instinct of long practice. Clerk could process some 600 letters per hour at peak speed, his hands moving in a continuous rhythm of pick, glance, throw, the letters flying from his fingers to their proper destinations with the precision of some elaborate mechanical device. The mail clerks themselves were drawn from a particular subset of the Federal Civil Service, men selected for their exceptional memory, their attention to detail, and their physical stamina, for the work was demanding both intellectually and physically. They worked in pairs aboard each train, and they were required to memorize the postal routes for the entire region in which they served, including not merely the names of every town along the railroad, but also the names of every smaller crossroads, post office, and rural delivery route whose mail might be transferred from this train to a connecting line at some junction along the way. To pass the regular examinations required of mail clerks, a man might need to recite from memory the postal designations of some 10,000 individual locations, organized geographically and updated continuously as new routes were established and old ones discontinued. The clerk worked at a long sloped desk that ran along the length of the carriage, sorting from a great canvas sack of incoming mail spread before him. Above his head, small gas lamps cast a focused light upon his work, supplemented during daylight hours by skylights set into the carriage's roof that allowed the natural light to illuminate the sorting tables. The carriage was equipped with a small stove for heating in winter and several small ventilation grills for cooling in summer, but the clerks worked in their shirt sleeves regardless of season, their hands moving too quickly for the encumbrance of jackets, their concentration too intense for awareness of weather. At certain points along the route, the mail train performed a remarkable feat of in-transit mail exchange that required no stop at all. As the train approached a small wayside station that did not warrant a full halt, the postmaster of that station would have prepared a small leather mail pouch and hung it from a tall hooked iron arm beside the tracks. The mail clerk aboard the train, alerted by the engineer's whistle and watching from a small open hatch in the side of the mail car, would extend a similar hooked arm from the side of the carriage as the train passed, snatching the waiting mail pouch from its post in a single smooth motion, while simultaneously casting out a similar pouch of outbound mail to thump down upon the platform beside the station. The whole exchange took less than a single second, and the train continued onward at full speed without ever slowing. This mail on the fly, as the railwaymen called it, was a feat of practiced precision that astonished the casual observer. The hooked arm extended from the carriage was designed to grasp the suspended pouch at exactly the proper height, and the engineer would have warned the clerks of the approaching exchange by sounding the whistle in a particular pattern. The clerks would brace themselves at the open hatch, their leather aprons protecting their clothing from the rush of wind, and at the precise moment they would extend the arm, feel the small jolt as the pouch was caught, and pull the captured pouch inward into the carriage even as their other hand released the outbound pouch into the slipstream. Years of practice produced a rate of successful exchanges so high that failures were considered newsworthy of mention in the railroad's internal newsletters. Within the carriage, the captured pouches were immediately opened and their contents added to the sorting flow. The clerks worked through the mail with continuous attention throughout the entire journey, and by the time the train reached its destination, every letter had been sorted into the proper outbound pouch for delivery to its final destination. The result was a postal service of extraordinary efficiency, capable of moving a letter from any small town in the east to any small town in the west within a span of days, at a postage rate of 3 cents for the basic letter, an amount that even the poorest farmer could afford without hardship. In addition to the mail service, the railroad maintained a parallel network of telegraph wires that ran alongside every mile of track, supported upon tall wooden poles spaced at regular intervals across the entire continent. These telegraph wires constituted the nervous system of the railroad, allowing the dispatchers in distant offices to communicate with station masters along the route, to coordinate the movements of trains, to warn of obstacles or accidents, and to relay urgent messages from one end of the line to the other within minutes of their composition. A passenger who wished to send a telegraph message could do so at any of the regular station stops along the route. The station master, who typically also served as the telegraph operator, would take down the message in pencil upon a small printed form, count the words, calculate the charge, and tap out the message in Morse code upon the brass telegraph key that sat upon his desk. The clicking of the key would travel along the wire at the speed of light, reaching the receiving station some hundreds or thousands of miles distant within a fraction of a second, where it would be transcribed by the receiving operator and delivered to its addressee by a small boy on a bicycle, often within an hour of its original sending. Together, these two systems, the postal mail and the electric telegraph, knit the vast distances of the continent into a coherent communicative whole, and made possible the modern commercial and personal life that the citizens of 1880 enjoyed. Pause for a moment, dear traveller, in the slow, comfortable rhythm of your journey, and allow your mind to drift toward a more contemplative reflection upon the nature of the experience in which you are now participating. The Pullman carriage of 1880 was, in a manner of speaking, a small floating island of time itself, a moving room in which the very experience of duration and distance became transformed in ways that the citizens of that era found strange and wonderful, and occasionally even troubling. Consider what it meant for the human soul of that age to be carried at 30 miles each hour across landscapes that had previously required weeks or months of arduous overland travel to cross. For the entire prior history of the human species, until the lifetime of the very passengers seated within this carriage, the rate of travel across the surface of the earth had been bounded by the speeds of which the human body and the bodies of domesticated animals were capable. A man on foot might cover 20 or 30 miles in a long day's walking. A man on horseback might extend that to 50 or 60 miles, though at the cost of considerable fatigue to himself and to his mount. A man in a carriage drawn by horses might achieve perhaps 80 or 90 miles in a day if the roads were good and if he changed his teams at regular post houses. Beyond these limits no human being had travelled, and no human being had imagined travelling since the first beginnings of civilization itself. And then, within the span of a single human lifetime, the whole of this immemorial relationship between man and distance had been transformed. The grandparents of the children now playing upon the parlour car floor had crossed similar distances by ox-drawn wagon at perhaps 15 miles per day, their journeys lasting through entire summers and into the early frosts of autumn. The parents of those children in their younger years before the war had travelled by stagecoach at perhaps 80 miles per day, with stops every 10 or 12 miles to change horses, sleeping at rude inns along the route, and arriving at their destinations weary and travel-stained from weeks upon the road. Now, the children themselves travelled in the velvet comfort of a Pullman carriage at 30 miles per hour, day and night without interruption, covering in 3 days a distance that their grandparents had covered in 3 months. This transformation of the experience of distance carried with it, almost necessarily, a transformation of the experience of time itself. The traveller aboard the Pullman carriage participated in a strange new sensation that the older generations had never known. A sensation of suspended time, of duration that passed without effort, of hours that arrived and departed without the labour that had previously been required to traverse them. There was a particular quality of leisure that this novelty produced, a quality difficult to describe to those who had grown up entirely within the railway age, but unforgettable to those who could remember the older modes of travel. The older travellers aboard the train, the gentlemen of 50 or 60 years of age who could remember the long stagecoach journeys of their youth, often spoke of this transformation with a complicated mixture of admiration and regret. The admiration was for the obvious advantages of speed, comfort, and reliability that the railway offered. The regret, expressed only in private conversations and only in the gentlest of terms, was for the loss of a certain depth of experience that the slower modes of travel had provided. When one had crossed Pennsylvania in a stagecoach over the span of 8 days, one had truly known Pennsylvania, had felt its forests in one's bones, had heard the songs of its birds and the rush of its streams, had stopped at its country inns and met its country people, had smelled its wood smoke and its hayfields and its kitchen gardens. Now, in the 1880 Pullman, one crossed Pennsylvania in a single afternoon and an evening, glimpsing it only through the window glass, and at the end one knew Pennsylvania chiefly as a sequence of station names announced by the conductor: Pittsburgh, Altoona, Harrisburg, Lancaster, Philadelphia. The depth of acquaintance was lost, and what remained was a kind of geographical knowledge of headlines without the accompanying knowledge of the body of the text. Whether this loss was worth the gain in efficiency, the older travellers were uncertain, and they often confessed that they were the last generation who would know what they had lost. The younger travellers, those born after the railroad had become the standard mode of long-distance journeying, did not feel this loss because they had never known the older experience that produced it. To them, travelling at 30 miles per hour in a velvet armchair, while the continent unfurled beyond the window, was simply what travel was, just as to a later generation travelling at 600 miles per hour above the clouds in a metal tube would simply be what travel was. Each new generation accepted the technological norms of its own time as the natural order, and only the older travellers retained the comparative memory that allowed them to recognise how strange and how unprecedented their present circumstances actually were. The very keeping of time aboard the train participated in this transformation. Until the 1880s, every American town had kept its own local time, set by the position of the sun at noon at that particular longitude, so that towns even 10 or 20 miles apart might differ from each other by a minute or two in their official clocks. This had not mattered in the era of stagecoach travel, when travel between towns required hours, but it had become increasingly impossible to manage as railway speeds made it necessary to coordinate schedules across vast distances. In the year 1880, this confusion was being addressed by a movement towards standardized railway time, with the great railroad networks adopting unified time zones for their operations. By 1883, just 3 years after the imagined date of our present journey, the railroads would formally introduce the 4 standard time zones that we still recognize today: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. For the passenger aboard the Pullman, this meant that the very meaning of time itself was undergoing transformation as the train travelled. The clock above the conductor's station might be set to the official time of one particular city, while the sun outside the window indicated a different local time entirely. To a contemplative traveller, this could produce a strange dreamlike sensation that one was travelling not merely through space but also through time, slipping continuously across invisible boundaries where the official hour shifted by a few minutes or by a full hour at a stroke. The familiar earthly experience of time as a uniform medium in which all events occurred at the same rate everywhere was gently dissolving, and a new experience of time as a complex grid of conventions and standards was taking its place. To sit in the velvet armchair and contemplate these matters, while the carriage rocked gently and the prairie unfurled beyond the glass, was to participate in one of the great philosophical adventures of the 19th century, an adventure of which most of the participants were only dimly aware, but which nevertheless marked them all in subtle and permanent ways. There existed aboard the long-distance Pullman carriage a quiet social phenomenon so peculiar to the railway age that no precise word existed to describe it, though the travellers of the era recognized it well and spoke of it often in their letters and memoirs. It was the curious intimacy that developed between strangers who had been thrown together for the duration of a multi-day journey, an intimacy that flowered briefly within the enclosed world of the carriage and then faded gently when the journey concluded, leaving behind in each participant only a fond memory of fleeting human companionship and a small handful of exchanged business cards that might or might not ever be acted upon. Consider how this gentle phenomenon unfolded over the course of a typical 4-day journey from Chicago to San Francisco. On the first morning, the travellers boarded as complete strangers to one another, settling into their assigned seats with the quiet politeness that characterized public spaces of the era, exchanging only brief courteous nods of greeting and occasional pardon me's when navigating the narrow corridor. Each traveller retained the social armour of his or her ordinary public self, addressing fellow passengers only when necessary and otherwise maintaining the invisible boundaries that separated strangers from one another in the wider world. By the second morning, however, certain quiet shifts had begun to occur in the social atmosphere of the carriage. 2 gentlemen who had happened to sit at adjacent seats in the dining car the previous evening had discovered some small common ground, perhaps a shared acquaintance in Cincinnati or a mutual interest in the silver mining ventures of Colorado. Then they now sought each other out for another shared meal, falling into conversation with the easy familiarity of acquaintances of long standing. 2 ladies travelling separately had recognized each other's accents as both being of Boston origin, and had begun a conversation in the parlour car that had quickly progressed from polite small talk to the discovery of mutual friends in the Beacon Hill neighbourhood, and from there to the warm intimacy of 2 compatriots far from home. By the 3rd day, the carriage had transformed itself into a temporary community in which most of the passengers knew most of the other passengers by name, by background, by the general outline of their reasons for travelling. The young couple travelling on their wedding journey had been adopted by an elderly aunt figure who advised them upon the particulars of housekeeping in San Francisco, where she had once lived for several years. The widowed lady in mourning had found a sympathetic listener in a businessman whose own wife had passed away some years before, and the 2 of them spent the long afternoons in quiet conversation about loss and the slow consolations of memory. The small children of the carriage had become the universal pets of all the adults, doted upon and indulged with, small treats from the dining car and small entertainments invented for their amusement. This rapid blooming of intimacy among strangers was made possible by several distinctive features of the Pullman experience. First, there was the simple fact of enclosed proximity over an extended period of time, which forced fellow travellers into repeated brief encounters that gradually accumulated into familiarity. Second, there was the shared experience of the journey itself, the common subject of conversation that the passing landscape and the small events of the carriage continuously provided. Third, there was the relative homogeneity of the passenger company, all of them being persons of sufficient means to afford Pullman travel, all of them sharing certain general assumptions about manners, conversation, and propriety. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, there was the temporary quality of the encounter itself, the knowledge that whatever intimacy developed among the passengers would dissolve upon arrival at the destination, freeing each participant to share with the others a candour and a warmth that would have been more guarded among acquaintances expected to remain in continuing relationship. This last feature of the railway intimacy is perhaps the most psychologically interesting. There exists in the human soul a hunger for genuine encounter with other human souls that is often constrained in ordinary social life, be the prudent recognition that any intimacy shared today must be lived with tomorrow and must be reconciled with the continuing structure of one's social position. With strangers met aboard a train, this constraint did not apply. One could speak frankly of one's hopes and one's disappointments, of the difficult brother in Pittsburgh or the lost son in the war, of the dreams not pursued or the loves not declared, knowing that within a few days these confidences would be dispersed across the continent and would never return to complicate one's daily life. Young woman travelling alone, perhaps a teacher heading to a new position in some western mining town, might find herself confiding in an older married woman the doubts and fears she had not been able to share with her own family in the East. The older woman, in turn, might offer her own counsel and her own quiet stories, drawing upon a lifetime of experience that the younger woman had no other access to. By the end of the journey, both would feel they had received a gift of considerable value, though neither would expect to see the other again, and both would carry forward the memory of that brief intimacy as a small treasure preserved in the cabinet of memory. Gentlemen, too, participated in this gentle phenomenon, though the conventions of masculine reticence in 1880 meant that their confidences took different forms. A young man heading west to make his fortune might receive from an older successful businessman the kind of practical wisdom about commerce, character, and the management of opportunity that no formal education could provide. Traveller returning from a difficult business venture might find consolation in the listening ear of a stranger who had himself faced similar disappointments and could speak of recovery from a position of authentic experience. These exchanges, though brief, often proved formative for the lives that followed them. When at last the journey ended and the passengers prepared to disembark at their respective destinations, a particular gentle melancholy often settled over the carriage. The community that had grown so naturally over the days of shared travel now prepared to dissolve, and the participants recognized that they would likely never reconvene. There were exchanges of cards, of addresses, of vague assurances that letters might be written and visits might someday be paid. Few of these promises were actually kept, and a few of the railway acquaintances ripened into friendships that lasted for years afterward. Most of them, however, faded gently into memory, becoming part of that vast unspoken archive of brief human connections that constituted, for many travellers of the era, one of the most precious aspects of railway travel. The participants would carry forward into their separate futures the small invisible imprint of each other's presence, never quite forgotten and never quite remembered, like the trace of a fragrance encountered once on a summer evening many years ago. Among the many small rituals of the long railway journey, few possessed a more particular quality of contemplative beauty than the writing of letters from aboard the moving train. The passenger of 1880 was, in a way that has become entirely foreign to our present age, a person for whom the written letter constituted the primary means of remaining connected to family, to friends, and to the wider human world from which any extended journey separated the traveller. To sit at a small writing desk in the parlour car, with a pen in hand and a sheet of crisp Pullman stationery before one, while the great American continent unfurled outside the window, was to participate in one of the most quintessentially 19th century of all activities, the slow, patient labour of correspondence. The Pullman Company provided within each parlour car a small writing desk equipped with all the requirements of letter writing for the convenience of its passengers. The desk itself was a cleverly designed piece of furniture, a small folding writing surface mounted upon a swivelling brass arm that could be drawn out from the wall and adjusted to the proper height for the seated writer. When not in use, the desk folded flush against the panelling and disappeared as entirely as the upper berths did during the day. When extended for use, it presented a generous writing surface of polished walnut, its edges raised slightly to prevent papers from sliding off when the train rounded a curve. Set into the desk's surface was a small recessed inkwell, fitted with a hinged brass cover that closed automatically when the user lifted the pen, an ingenious device that prevented spillage even during the rocking of the carriage. Beside the inkwell, a small grooved channel held the pen itself, a steel-nibbed pen of the kind manufactured by the Estabrook Company in New Jersey, with a polished mother-of-pearl handle that fit comfortably between the fingers. A small silver-rimmed sandcaster stood ready to dust the wet ink with fine blotting sand, and beside it lay a sheet of pink blotting paper for those who preferred the more modern method of pressing the wet ink dry. The stationery itself was provided by the Pullman Company in fitted leather portfolios that contained writing paper of fine cream-coloured linen weave, with the small Pullman crest embossed in the upper corner in a discreet relief that caught the light only when the paper was held at certain angles. The matching envelopes were of the same paper, lined with thin tissue of a pale rose color, sealed with small adhesive flaps that the writer would moisten lightly with his tongue before pressing closed. There were also, for the more formal correspondence, sheets of slightly heavier paper bearing the full Pullman crest in a more elaborate engraving, suitable for the writing of business letters or for correspondence with persons of particular dignity. The act of writing such a letter aboard a moving train possessed a particular quality of contemplation that the letter writer often noted in the very text of the letter itself. The slight, gentle motion of the carriage produced a small tremor in the handwriting that could not be entirely suppressed, lending the letters a distinctive quality that the recipient would recognize at a glance. The writer would sometimes apologize for this tremor in the opening lines of the letter, explaining the conditions of composition with a kind of pleased self-consciousness that suggested the writer was aware of participating in a relatively novel form of communication. The contents of such letters reveal much about the inner experience of the railway traveller in 1880. Young man writing home to his mother in Vermont, travelling westward to take up a new position in a Denver mercantile firm, might describe the wonders of the journey in terms designed to reassure his mother of his comfort and safety. He would write of the velvet seats and the polished brass fittings, of the elaborate meals served in the dining car, of the courteous attention of the porters and the agreeable companionship of his fellow passengers. He would mention the names of the towns through which the train had passed, providing his mother with a kind of geographical record that she could later trace upon the small map of the United States that hung in the family parlor. Young woman writing to her sister, traveling alone for the first time in her life to visit relatives in Salt Lake City, might allow herself a more reflective tone, describing the strange dreamlike quality of the journey, the sensation of being suspended between two homes, the curious intimacy of meals taken with strangers, the small adventures of station stops in unfamiliar towns. She might confess to small homesickness even as she described her excitement, and might ask after the small details of home life that she found herself missing more than she had expected. Businessman writing to his partner in Boston, carrying with him the contracts for a new venture in the silver mines of Leadville, might compose a more methodical letter of progress reports and instructions, but even within the formal frame of business correspondence he would likely allow himself a few lines of more personal observation, describing the weather along the route or the sight of a particular landscape that had impressed him. The letters once written, sealed, and addressed were entrusted to the porter, who would carry them forward to the mail car for inclusion in the next outgoing dispatch at the next station stop. From there they would travel through the postal system that we have already described, reaching their destinations within a span of days. The recipient, opening the letter perhaps a week after its writing, would hold in their hands an object that had been composed somewhere in the open spaces of the American continent, perhaps in Nebraska or in Wyoming or in the desert reaches of Utah, and would feel through the paper itself a small, gentle thread of connection to the distant traveller. For those of us in our own century, accustomed as we are to instantaneous electronic communication that spans continents in milliseconds and that may be composed and dispatched without any particular ceremony or thought, the patient letter writing aboard the Pullman carriage of 1880 represents something almost incomprehensibly different in its texture and its significance. Letter, then, was not a casual jotting, but a small considered work, demanding time, attention, and care, expecting in return the pleasure of a similar letter written in reply some days hence. The slow rhythm of correspondence by post, with its days of writing and its days of waiting, had a contemplative quality that our own faster modes of communication have made increasingly difficult to recover. To write a letter from aboard the Pullman carriage with the prairie outside the window and the gentle motion of the rails beneath the writing desk was to participate in this contemplative rhythm at its most essential. The writer sat suspended between origin and destination, between the world being left behind and the world being approached, and from that suspended vantage point sent forth small considered words to the people who awaited news. Each letter became in a sense a small bridge across the vast distances of the continent, connecting one human heart to another by means of paper and ink and patience and time. There remained, throughout the long days and nights of the Pullman journey, a particular gift that the railway carriage offered to its passengers, a gift so subtle that many travelers received it without quite realizing what they had received, and yet a gift whose value the wisest among them recognized as among the most precious offerings of the entire railway age. This was the gift of the slow hour, the unhurried passage of duration in which nothing was demanded of the soul except its own continuing presence. Consider what it meant for the citizen of 1880 to find oneself enclosed within a velvet parlour for 3 or 4 days of continuous travel, with no urgent tasks to be performed, no household to be managed, no business to be transacted, no obligations to be met. For the businessman accustomed to the relentless demands of his Chicago or Boston office, this enforced leisure was at first a strange and almost unsettling experience. He would find himself reaching unconsciously for the morning newspaper that no longer existed in this form, turning to the desk that bore no waiting correspondence, looking for the appointment book in which no appointments were scheduled. The first day of such a journey might be passed in a kind of restless adjustment, as the businessman gradually realized that his accustomed rhythms of activity had no purchase in this suspended environment. By the second day, however, a deeper rhythm would begin to assert itself, one that the businessman might not have experienced in years, and that would feel, when it arrived, like a return to some half-forgotten dimension of his own being. He would notice that the velvet upholstery had a particular texture beneath his fingertips. He would observe that the light fell through the window in a particular pattern that shifted slowly with the position of the sun. He would become aware of his own breathing, of the small, gentle rhythms of his own body, of thoughts that arose and passed without urgency or consequence. He would begin to read a book with attention rather than scanning it for usable information. He would engage in conversation with a fellow passenger without watching the clock for the moment when he must conclude. This deeper rhythm was, in a sense, the natural rhythm of the human creature, the rhythm to which the human body and soul had been adapted across countless millennia before the modern industrial age accelerated everything to its present feverish tempo. It was the rhythm of the long evening before the parlour fire, of the slow Sunday afternoon, of the quiet hour spent watching a stream flow past or a herd of sheep grazing in an open field. It was the rhythm of the contemplative life, the rhythm of prayer and meditation, the rhythm of poetry and philosophy, and the slow accumulation of wisdom. It had been, for most of human history, the dominant rhythm of human existence, and it was being increasingly displaced in the modern age by the faster rhythms of industry, commerce, and urban life. The Pullman carriage, by virtue of its very design and operation, restored this slower rhythm to its passengers in a way that few other features of 19th century life were able to do. Within the carriage one could not work, even if one wished to, for the necessary materials of work were not present and could not be summoned. One could not transact business in real time, for the telegraph and the post were available only at distant station stops. One could not visit one's neighbours or attend one's church or fulfil any of the ordinary social obligations that filled the days at home. One could only be, simply and patiently, in the presence of one's own consciousness and the consciousness of one's fellow travellers, while the great machine of the train carried one onward through the great unfolding landscape. For some travellers, this enforced contemplative leisure proved to be among the most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. Letters and memoirs of the era contain numerous accounts of what we might now call epiphanies that occurred aboard the Pullman carriage, moments of sudden insight or quiet conversion that arose from the simple fact of having been given several days of unstructured time in which to think. Businessmen might recognize in the course of staring out at the prairie for several hours on end that the success he had been pursuing for the past decade was not actually what he wanted from his life. A young woman might realize, while watching the sun set behind the Wasatch Mountains, that the engagement she was traveling to confirm was one she should refuse. A grieving widow might find in the slow contemplation of distant cottonwoods the first soft consolations that began the long work of healing. These insights and recognitions were not produced by any deliberate effort of meditation or self-examination. They simply arose as such insights arise when the mind is given enough quiet space in which to settle and clarify. The mud at the bottom of a disturbed pond will eventually settle if the pond is left undisturbed for long enough, and the water will become clear and the bottom of the pond will become visible. The minds of the Pullman passengers, troubled by the constant disturbances of ordinary life, similarly settled during the long, quiet hours of the journey, and what had been hidden beneath the surface of their thoughts gradually became visible. This was perhaps the deepest gift that the Pullman carriage offered to its travellers. Beneath all the more obvious gifts of comfort and elegance and convenience, it offered them themselves. It offered them the experience of being present with their own minds and their own hearts in a sustained and uninterrupted way that the busy pace of modern life otherwise prevented. It offered them a rest that was not merely physical but philosophical, a Sabbath of the soul in which the deepest questions could rise quietly to the surface and find, sometimes, their quiet answers. The traveller who returned home from such a journey was not always the same person who had departed. Something had been clarified, something had been settled, something had been understood. The journey itself, in its outward sense of distance traversed, had been only the surface of an experience whose deeper substance was the inward journey that had paralleled it. The mountains and the prairies and the rivers had been less the destinations than the companions of an internal journey that had moved its passenger from one understanding of life to another. This is the secret that the slow hours of the Pullman carriage held for those passengers patient enough to receive it, that the journey across the American continent was, for those who took it with the right attention, also a journey across the inner landscapes of the soul, and that what one found in the West was sometimes not what one had come seeking, but rather something far more valuable that had been waiting all along. The hours have grown late now, dear traveller, and the carriage has settled into its deepest evening quietude. The lamps have been turned down to their lowest steady glow, casting only the gentlest amber light along the corridor, just enough to illuminate the path of any passenger making a quiet visit to the lavatory, but not enough to disturb the slumbers of those who have already retired behind their drawn curtains. Beyond the windows, the prairie has dissolved into deep velvet darkness, broken only by the distant twinkle of stars and the occasional faint glow of a farmhouse lamp far off across the grass. The train moves onward through the night, faithful and unhurrying, and you yourself have been carried gently toward the threshold of sleep. Settle now more deeply into the velvet of your seat, or if you have moved to your berth, into the soft yielding of the mattress beneath you. Feel how the carriage rocks with that particular gentle rhythm that has become, over the hours of your journey, as familiar as the rhythm of your own breathing. The small click-clack of the wheels passing over the rail joints continues its slow, patient music, no faster and no slower than it has been for hour upon hour, its very steadiness, now a kind of soft hypnotic chant that draws the mind downward toward rest. Click-clack, 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 the rhythm endlessly repeating, endlessly the same, endlessly soothing. Allow your eyes to grow heavy now. Allow your eyelids to drift downward of their own slow accord. There is nothing that requires your attention any longer. The porter is awake and tending to all the small needs of the carriage. The conductor is awake and verifying all the schedules. The engineer is awake at the head of the train, his eyes upon the rails, illuminated by the great headlamp, his hand steady upon the throttle. The fireman is awake, feeding the firebox in his measured rhythm. All the necessary labours of the journey are being performed by these faithful men, who are awake so that you may sleep, who are vigilant so that you may rest, who are tending the great machine of the train so that it may carry you safely through the long quiet night. The mattress beneath you, you may notice, has the particular quality of seeming to absorb your body's weight gently, neither too firm nor too soft, accepting your shape as though it had been waiting all day for the moment of your arrival. The pillow beneath your head, plump with goose down, supports your neck in just the right manner, its cool cotton slip soft against your cheek. The woolen blanket drawn up to your chin holds in your body's gentle warmth, creating a small private climate of perfect comfort within the larger climate of the carriage. The serge curtain, drawn closed beside you, creates a small dark chamber of privacy, separating you from the corridor and from the other sleeping passengers, a small womb-like space of complete enclosure. Within this space your senses begin to drift. You hear the distant whistle of the locomotive sounding once, far at the head of the train, a long, low, melodic call that seems almost to come from another world entirely, soft and beautiful and a little melancholy, the very voice of the railway in its golden age. The whistle fades and silence returns, broken only by the steady click-clack of the wheels, the gentle creak of the wooden panelling, the soft rush of the wind passing along the carriage's exterior. You hear perhaps the faint sigh of a sleeping passenger in a nearby berth, breathing slowly and rhythmically, having entered already into the deep, quiet country of sleep. You hear the soft pad of the porter's footsteps as he passes down the corridor on some quiet errand, his shoes muffled by the heavy carpet, his presence reassuring and unobtrusive. You hear the gentle tinkle of a brass chain swaying somewhere in the carriage, a sound so small that it seems almost imagined, a tiny musical chime that comes and goes in the gentle rocking of the train. The smells of the carriage drift around you in their familiar, comforting layers. The cedarwood panelling, the beeswax polish, the faint kerosene of the dimmed lamps, the lingering ghost of someone's evening tea, the clean scent of the linen sheets and pillowcases laundered in lavender water some days before in the great Pullman commissary kitchens. These scents blending together compose the unmistakable perfume of the Pullman carriage at night, a perfume that the regular travellers came to find as comforting as the smell of their own homes. Outside the windows, beyond the heavy curtains, the night continues its slow procession across the continent. The stars wheel slowly overhead in their ancient courses, the constellations moving from east to west in their endless patient rotation. The Milky Way arches across the sky from horizon to horizon, undimmed by any city's lights, a great silver river of countless suns. The moon, if it is up, lays a silver path across the prairie grass, and the long shadows of distant cottonwoods stretch eastward across the silvered earth. The train moves through this sleeping landscape at its steady 30 miles per hour, its great headlamp casting a moving pool of light along the rails ahead, its small interior lights glowing faintly through the drawn curtains of the windows, its long dark form passing through the night like some patient mythological creature carrying its sleeping cargo across the great spaces of the continent. From a distant farmhouse, a wakeful farmer or his sleepless wife might glimpse the train passing in the distance, a moving constellation of small warm lights crossing the horizon, and might pause for a moment to wonder about the travellers within who are themselves wondering nothing now, who are slipping deeper and deeper into the quiet country of sleep. You yourself are slipping deeper now into that warm, soft darkness that lies just below the surface of waking thought. The clicks and clacks of the wheels continue their steady rhythm, but they reach you now from a greater distance, as though they are sounding within a larger and more dreamlike space than the actual carriage in which you rest. The gentle rocking of the train continues, but it has become merged with the larger rocking of your own slowing breath, and the boundary between the two has begun to dissolve. The lamplight glows softly through the curtain. The mattress holds you gently, the blanket warms you faithfully, the wheels click and clack and click and clack, the wind hums softly along the carriage, the distant whistle calls once more, even softer than before, even further away, and you drift and you drift and you drift gently and easily toward the long, warm, welcoming dark. Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. The wheels continue their slow, patient music beneath you, and you continue your slow, patient drifting towards sleep, and the train continues its slow, patient passage through the long American night. There is nothing more for you to do now, nothing more for you to think about, nothing more for you to remember or to consider or to plan. The journey carries itself. The carriage holds you gently. The night enfolds the carriage in its great soft darkness, and all is well. All is well. All is well. Feel the mattress beneath you, soft and yielding and warm. Feel the pillow beneath your head, plump and cool and welcoming. Feel the blanket drawn up to your chin, holding in your gentle body warmth. Feel the rhythmic rocking of the carriage, slow and steady and unending. Feel your own breathing, deepening now, slowing now, growing softer and softer with each gentle rise and fall of your chest. The lamplight glows softly somewhere beyond the curtain, casting only the faintest amber suggestion of light into your small private chamber. The world has shrunk in this approaching sleep to the small soft space of your berth, and within this space all is comfort, All is safety, all is peace. Beyond the curtain, the carriage continues. Beyond the carriage, the train continues. Beyond the train, the prairie continues, and the night continues, and the slow turning of the earth itself continues in its great patient rotation. But none of these larger continuings demands anything of you. You have only to rest, and to drift, and to allow the journey to carry you onward. Click, clack, click, clack. The wheels are perhaps the gentlest sound you have ever known, a sound so small and so steady that it has become almost indistinguishable from silence itself. A sound that simply is, like the sound of waves upon a distant shore, or the sound of wind through far-off pines. Listen to it for a moment longer, and then allow even your listening to grow soft and dreamy and indistinct. The locomotive's whistle sounds once more, far at the head of the train, even softer now than before, even further away, like the call of some great gentle bird heard from across a vast meadow at twilight. The whistle fades and the carriage rocks and the wheels click softly, and you drift further into the warm dark. The mattress is so comfortable, the pillow is so soft, the blanket is so warm. There is nowhere else you need to be, there is nothing else you need to do. There is no time at which you must wake, no place at which you must arrive, no task that awaits your attention. You are held entirely within the gentle care of the long, slow night, and the train, and the kind, unseen hands that tend it. Around you, the other passengers are sleeping their own slow sleep, each within their own small chamber of comfort, each rocked by the same gentle rhythm of the rails. The young mother sleeps with her two small children nestled against her, their small breaths rising and falling in concert. The elderly gentleman sleeps with his book closed beside him, his spectacles folded upon the small shelf, his white beard rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The young couple sleeps with their hands clasped beneath the blanket, their faces turned toward each other in the soft dark. The widow sleeps in her quiet, solitary berth, her dreams perhaps carrying her back to summers many years ago when her husband still walked beside her through the gardens of their home. All of these sleeping souls are being carried together in this great patient train, through the long quiet darkness, while the prairie rolls past in its endless gentle waves, while the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patient rotations, while the moon lays its silver path across the grasses, while the distant coyotes call to each other across the miles, while the slow great machine of the night continues its faithful turning. You are one of these sleepers now, drifting deeper, drifting softer, drifting into the warm, welcoming dark. The clicks of the wheels grow distant, distant, distant. The rocking of the carriage merges with the rocking of your own slowing breath. The lamplight fades into a memory of light, and then into the memory of a memory, and then into nothing at all. You are sleeping now, gently, deeply, peacefully. The train carries you onward through the long American night. The miles pass beneath the wheels, slow and steady and endless. The stars wheel overhead. The prairie rolls past in its great soft waves. The lamps glow faintly along the corridor, tended by the patient porter who keeps his quiet watch. The engineer keeps his hand upon the throttle at the head of the train. The fireman keeps his shovel rising and falling in its measured rhythm. All is well, all is well, all is well. Sleep, dear traveller. Sleep deeply and sweetly and long. There is nothing more that the night requires of you. The journey carries itself. The carriage holds you gently. The wheels click softly far below. The wind hums faintly along the carriage's exterior. The whistle calls once more very far away, very gentle, like the last note of a slow lullaby fading into silence. Sleep. 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 The carriage rocks, the wheels click, the lamps glow, the night enfolds, the miles pass beneath, the stars wheel overhead, the prairie rolls past, the train moves on, the night continues, the journey continues, and you sleep, and you sleep, and you sleep, held safely within the gentle, patient heart of the long, warm American night. Sleep softly, traveller, sleep deeply, traveller, Sleep until the slow gold of dawn arrives in its own good time, and the eastern sky lightens softly over the sleeping prairie, and the whistle calls again across the morning grasses, and the new day begins. But that is many hours yet from now. For now there is only the night, and the carriage, and the wheels, and the slow steady rocking, and the warm soft darkness, and the quiet rest that wraps you in its great gentle arms. Sleep, sleep, sleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.